So now that we understand how to work with materials within this workflow, I've just brought together all of what we've already seen into one little simple scene here so that we can move on to looking at cameras. Now let me just explain to you how I set up the scene real quickly so that you can set up a similar type scene on your own, and then we can proceed from there. So first off, these are just 3 cubes, 2 meters by 2 meters by 2 meters. And the idea here is that I've set the material that we made in the last video here, and then I brought in the MXM mode materials that we made in the previous video onto these cubes. Now, in addition to that, the environment settings here are exactly the same thing that I set up in the last video. So there's really nothing here that you haven't seen. There's only one thing that you haven't seen so far, and that is that I have selected these objects here and I've made them groups. And the reason why is because once something is grouped, we have the access of a particular context menu, which is right here at the bottom for Maxwell. What we can do then is we can come in here and we can change the UV coordinates. And what I've done is I've just come over here and I've set it for default SketchUp. And the reason why is because when I was applying these MXM mode materials, things were getting a little bit weird as far as the UVs were concerned. So basically that just allowed me to get the UVs to match up with what I was seeing in the SketchUp viewport. And that's a very important thing because we want to be able to see a 1-to-1 ratio between what we're seeing in the SketchUp viewport and what we're seeing in the Fire render. Now, we're going to be focusing on cameras, and the first thing to understand about cameras is that scenes are cameras, and cameras are scenes. So if we come over to Window, and we go to Scenes, we're going to go ahead and set up a couple scenes. So I'm going to set up this first scene, which is just where we're at right now, and then I'm just going to go ahead and zoom in something like so. And I'm going to set up another scene, just like so. Just that simple. Now, of course, just like any other type of SketchUp scenario, we can switch back and forth between these scenes, and effectively we can change all kinds of settings that we would normally change within these scenes, and Maxwell will respect all of that information. So understanding how to work with scenes in SketchUp is very, very important to having success within Maxwell. If we come over to the Maxwell Scene Manager, and we go to the Camera tab, you'll see that currently we're working in Scene 1, and any settings that we make in this Cameras tab will affect only Scene 1. If we go to Scene 2, you'll see that now we're using Scene 2, and any settings that we set in here will affect only Scene 2. Now, primarily, we're going to be looking at output resolution and focus and exposure. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to go back to the minimal view or the basic view by simply turning off that advanced view. And we're going to go ahead and focus for right now on our output resolution. Now, the most important thing to understand about output resolution is that these pixel values that you see here on the X and the Y do not matter. They really don't. And the reason why is because if we come over to Fire, remember when we have the settings button over here, the maximum resolution is determining the maximum resolution that the long side has. So right now, even though our long side is currently set for 1276 pixels, our maximum resolution is set for 320. Therefore, we're only going to get 320 on this long side. This is effectively only setting our aspect ratio. Now, by default, the way that this works is that whatever we see in our SketchUp viewport is our aspect ratio. However, we can set this to be any custom value that we want. So if I come over here and I change it from viewport to custom, you can see that I can choose from a number of presets if I wanted to, and I'll just choose something like this 800 by 600 preset. And I will be able to render that. So I'm going to hit done and just hit Fire Render to enable. And what you'll see is that what we're seeing in our viewport is not exactly what we're going to be getting in our Fire Render engine. And you might be saying to yourself, well, gee, I really want to be able to see what I'm getting before I go to render. Well, that's what this button right here is for. So if we just turn this button right here on, that's going to allow us to preview our aspect ratio in our SketchUp viewport. Now, in addition to that, we can come over here and we can turn off the lock icon here to lock the aspect ratio, and we can begin to adjust this to be whatever aspect ratio we want. And again, just sort of ignore these pixel values because they're not relevant. All we're working with here is just the aspect ratio, but because we have these black bars, we can see what we're getting in our SketchUp viewport before we go to render, and this can be something that can be really useful for your workflow. I tend to work this way with these black bars on most of the time. So I'm just going to go ahead and get this scene set someplace where I want it to be set. I'm fairly happy with this aspect ratio, and so I'm not going to make any more changes to that, but what I am going to do is I'm going to come over to Camera, and I'm going to go over to Field of View, and I'm going to type in 46 degrees, like so. And that's just going to give me a different type of field of view, something like so, a little bit more flatter, a little bit less perspective distortion. And I could go in there and I could adjust this to whatever I want manually. So maybe I want something a little bit more dramatic like that, but not too much more because it was pretty extreme before, and I didn't want that. I want something a little bit more like this, but that feels pretty good to me as far as my field of view. Now I've got my aspect ratio and my camera settings the way that I want them to be. I'm going to come over to scene 2 and I'm just going to context click on it and say update. And that way, whatever settings that I change in scene 1 will not affect whatever's going on in scene 2. So if I come over to scene 1, for instance, you'll see that fire is going to update and we're going to render out whatever we see in scene 1, and I can make whatever changes I wanted to here. When I go back to scene 2, all those settings changes that I made are saved as part of scene 2, and therefore we'll go right back to where we left off. And this is really sort of the key to working with cameras in Maxwell. Now you can have as many scenes and as many cameras as you want, and they can each have individual settings, and whatever you can save in a scene, Maxwell will respect, and that includes our shadow settings. So bear that in mind. Now, one thing that is worth talking about when we're talking about scenes is that a lot of times in SketchUp we're used to hiding geometry between scenes. Now there is a problem with that, and let me just show you what I mean. So if I'm going to come over here and I'm just going to take this piece of geometry and I'm just going to open up our layers palette here, and I'm going to come over here and I'm going to go to Window, and I'm going to come to Entity Info, and what I want to do is I want to create a new layer, Layer 1, and then I'm just going to take this solid group which we have right here selected, and we're just going to move that to Layer 1. So all that's pretty straightforward. We do that kind of thing in SketchUp all the time, right? We're going to turn off the visibility, and then we're going to go ahead and say Update. And then I'm going to go ahead and close out Fire. Now, when I go to re-export back to Fire by opening Fire and enabling Fire once more, you'll see that that geometry is not there in the scene, just exactly the way that we would expect. However, when we go back to scene 1, that geometry reappears exactly the way that we would always expect within SketchUp. However, what happens is because that geometry was hidden when we exported, it remains hidden when we change to scene 1. Therefore, you're going to want to make sure that you close out your Fire, go back to Fire, and re-enable to get a fresh export. Now, again, this becomes a little quirky because this is shown in this scene. We go back to scene 2 where it's supposed to be hidden, you'll see it's still there. So that's something to look out for when you're thinking about how scenes and cameras work in SketchUp, is that it really doesn't work well with hidden geometry between scenes. You're going to want to watch out for that because it can really catch you off guard when you're thinking, oh, well, that's the way SketchUp always worked. And it is the way that SketchUp works. However, Maxwell requires that you re-export each time you make a geometry change, like hiding a piece of geometry.